Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Asia Society. I'm Asia Society's president, Kyung-wha Kang. Thank you very much for being here today to honor the 2025 winner of the Asia Society's Osborn Elliott Prize for Excellence in Journalism on Asia. Since its establishment in 2003, the Osborn Elliott Prize, affectionately referred to as the Oz Prize, has been awarded annually to a writer or team of writers who has produced the best example of journalism about Asia, in print or online during the calendar year. The Oz Prize honors the late Osborn Elliott, a legendary journalist and former editor-in-chief of Newsweek, who set new standards for reporting and editing and became one of the earliest practitioners of civic journalism, with a deliberate focusing of the journalistic enterprise on urgent issues of public affairs and beyond. We are extremely grateful to the Elliott family for their support of this prize. I'm delighted to have some members of the Elliott family here today, including Dorinda Elliot, who serves on the Oz Prize jury, and her husband, Adi Ignatius, as well as Alec McCabe and his wife, Catherine Tashef. Thank you. And my sincere appreciation also goes to the members of the independent jury for this prize, chaired by Marcus Brauchli, co-founder and managing partner of North Base Media and former editor of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. We have some additional members of the jury here today, too. Norman Perlstein, thank you, and Nisid Hajari, thank you. And further, we are pleased to have the first winner of the prize as well, Elizabeth Rosenthal. Is she here? On her way, maybe? Anyway. She was our very first prize winner, and thank you all so much for coming to share this evening. And now my heartfelt congratulations to this year's winner of this exceptional prize, the Associated Press and PBS Frontline, for their extraordinary project, South Korea's Adoption Reckoning. This is a very painful part of Korea's modern history, and I have a personal story to share about that later if you're interested, but this is more formal. So we are really thrilled to have several people behind the project here with us today, including our three panelists. I understand that beginning next month from July 19th, the adoption system in South Korea will come under the government's responsibility. That is, the overall adoption process will now be managed by the state and local governments, not existing private agencies, which has been the case so far. So I also know that the new government of President Lee Jae-myung, which has just been inaugurated, has firmly pledged to make every effort to put this reformed public adoption system in place. And I do believe that these changes themselves manifest the very impact of investigative journalism as exemplified by today's honorees. So I very much look forward to today's conversation. And before we turn to the discussion, let me now invite Dorinda Elliot, Executive Director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, Harvard University, and Oz Prize juror, as well as Jury Chair Marcus Brauchli, to say a few words about the prize and to present the prize itself. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you so much to the Asia Society for organizing this award and for hosting this wonderful event. We're really, really grateful. And I also want to give a special thank you to Marcus Brauchli for herding us cats and making the jury happen. It's a lot of work, and we're very, very grateful. And I want to give a special shout out to Elaine Mergurian, who's standing in the back there. She has been running this prize for many years now. I think it's something like 25 years. And were you running it at the beginning? No, okay, but she's been running it for many years, and she is just absolutely amazing. Makes it easy for all of us, and is such a pro at everything she does, and we're very, very grateful, Elaine, for that. So, so I'm Dorinda Elliot, and I'm here because I was a journalist for 30 years, firstly, and as we all know, once a journalist, always a journalist. But I'm also Oz Elliott's daughter, so. I'm thrilled to have a chance to say, a few words about him and about and to celebrate today's winners. My father cared a lot about this institution, so I'm really thrilled to be part of this today. Oz Elliott was the editor of Newsweek magazine during its heyday in the 60s, a time when journalists were widely respected. Imagine that. Uncovering investigations such as Watergate and documenting seismic social change, such as the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and the Women's Liberation Movement. What I want to say today, though, is that Oz Elliott would have been very, very proud to be associated with this amazing series of heart-wrenching investigative reports and the documentary on abuses in South Korea's adoption system produced by the Associated Press and FRONTLINE. We all know the press is under siege today. And for sure, the press may not be perfect, but what the media is facing today is nothing short of an existential threat. Not only is the current administration going after media they don't like with threats and crippling lawsuits, we've watched for years as Trump has intentionally spread insidious lies. He continues to do so, planting seeds of doubt about the truth, even challenging the value of truth. The end result is that the public no longer trusts the press, and the result is corrosive and threatens our very democracy. And this is exactly why it's so important to celebrate great journalism like this project tonight. Oz Elliott talked a lot about the need for journalists to have a fire in the belly, the insatiable passion to find and publish the truth. He also believed that journalists have a responsibility to society, that journalists should be human beings first. He would have been moved by the humanity and the compassion with which these journalists pursued these heartbreaking adoption stories. Why does a series of stories about adoption abuses matter? It matters because with each story about an adoption that went wrong, with each story about kidnapping and abuse, about adoptees discovering their own real stories, we're validating the lives of each of these individuals and their parents with the hope that this will not happen again. Each story grants them their humanity, tells them that they are important. And this project also makes us think hard about how well-intended systems can go so wrong. These adoption stories really embody the sense of social responsibility that Oz cared about so much. One dogged reporter, Tong-Hyung Kim, discovered abuses in Korea and wondered how deep they went. The project brought in Claire Galofaro and from AP's investigative team, and the two of them dug and dug and dug until they both got the human stories and the big picture stories about governments being complicit in profoundly unethical practices. Lora Moftah brought it all to life with the impactful Frontline documentary. Their work epitomizes the drive for the truth and the sense of humanity that Oz believed was the stuff of great journalism. Congratulations to I forgot to mention actually Mary Rajkumar, who was the editor who brought it all together as well. So congratulations to Tong-Hyung Kim, Claire Galofaro, Lora Moftah, and Mary Rajkumar. Congratulations.
Thank you, Dorinda. Thank you, President Kang. I want to, first of all, associate myself with all of Dorinda's comments on journalism, the importance of it, as well as the excellent work that was done by the award winners. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Asia Society, dedicated as it is to bringing understanding of Asia to Americans and finding a future that both sides of the Pacific must share. And in tonight's award, I think, in many ways, is truly delivering on that mission. You've heard Dorinda's brief explanation of the work, and we'll get into more detail in a moment in a conversation. But it was the product of years of effort by two Associated Press reporters and the powerful documentation of their work by a team from the Frontline unit of public broadcasting system that Lora led. Remarkable stories like this, I hope you'll agree, show the importance of the work that the public broadcasting system does. This project was an extraordinary deep dive into a generations-long South Korean program of sending orphans and other children abroad for adoption. And it powerfully found that many of the people adopted as children weren't told the truth about the circumstances of their adoption, that many of their biological parents never knew what happened to their children, and that many of their adoptive parents didn't know either. For hundreds of thousands of adoptees, I think it was 200,000 altogether from Korea, the elusive nature of their origins isn't just profoundly frustrating, it's an emotional weight that they bear in life. You will hear more about the project in a minute, but I wanted to briefly tell you about the process by which this prize is awarded. We have an exemplary jury, as you heard before. Norm Pearlstein, who's sitting over there, former editor-in-chief at Time Inc., the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, also former top content officer at Bloomberg. Nasid Hajari, who is here, an author and Bloomberg View editor. Someone who's not here, Zoraida Ibrahim, who's the managing editor of the South China Morning Post, and of course, most importantly, Dinda, who's both a journalist and the daughter of Oz Elliott. This year, as every year, we got extraordinary entries from media groups in the region as well as global news outlets. There were themes that we have seen and recognized in this panel before, including the often grinding lives of women in South Asia, the myriad environmental challenges accompanying Asia's rapid development, and the imposing scale of the political and economic problems facing China. It is always hard to pick a winner from among the entries. This year, interestingly, it came down to, among the jurors, two entries, this entry and another remarkable package by Bloomberg about the global trade in human eggs and surrogacy. Both entries, in other words, described how demand for children in richer countries was stimulating a trade in life, in eggs and in orphans, in less advantaged countries. So with that, we will present the award, and then we'll have a conversation with the journalists about their work. So please join us up here. So thank you all for being here. And I know one of your AP colleagues isn't here, but I'd love to start this by just maybe asking you to tell us a little bit more about the stories, because I'm not sure everybody here will have seen the excellent documentary or read the package of stories. So if you two would like to maybe just talk to us about what this story found and how it came about.
Sure. And I think I should begin by saying who's not here, which is, I think, our most important colleague, Tong-Hyung Kim. This whole project would not have existed without him. He learned of this almost a decade ago and sort of became obsessed with it. He couldn't stop. He got his teeth into it and just couldn't let it go. I think every great journalist has that one story that's kind of your thing. And eventually, over time, he just kept, Tong-Hyung, I think it's important to note, is a breaking news reporter, in Korea. So he's covering the threat of nuclear war every day and also chipping away at this adoption project in his free time, essentially. And so after he made quite a bit of progress, he talked to dozens and dozens of adoptees as they made their way back to Korea in these incredible emotional journeys to try to understand where they came from, to try to learn their own histories. He went with them to adoption agencies in these sort of tearful attempts to find who they are. And he became really invested in understanding what his country had done. And so after many years of this work on his own, he partnered with, Mary is my editor on the investigative team. And so we partnered with him and we started working together. And my role in this was to try to figure out what the Western governments knew, what the Western adoption agencies did. And so essentially our work showed that for many years, for decades, what began in the 1950s in the aftermath of the Korean War as a small humanitarian effort to save the lives of war orphans expanded really rapidly as this, in the midst of this sort of collision between Korea's attempts to economically develop in the aftermath of the war and this Western demand for babies. The United States, European countries desperately wanted babies. And these two things came together, and it created an industry where over time, Korea was shipping out thousands of babies a year, mostly to the United States, with almost no oversight. And our reporting showed that a lot of those kids grew up and went back to Korea and found that the stories they were told all their lives were not true, that they were taken from their birth families who were alive, that some of them were outright kidnapped from their yards, that they were the victims of a money-making industry, and governments turned a blind eye to that.
So Tong-Hyung works on this investigation for years, almost independently. And I think, you know, the very smart people at the AP could see the potential of what this work could be, and brought it to Frontline, which is where I met Tong-Hyung. And he has this sprawling, intricate investigation, thousands of pages of documents and, you know, interviews with officials and adoption workers who have given these interviews at great risk, but most importantly, adoptees, some of whom are, you know, in the process of discovering their own backstories, their origins, these really sort of emotional journeys. And so just talking to him and trying to sort of understand how do we turn this into a documentary, because we're talking about decades and, you know, multiple countries. Adoptees are adopted mostly to the United States. Out of the 200,000, I think about half of them ended up in the United States, but also Western Europe, Australia. So they're all over the place. This is this massive international investigation. And so in terms of, you know, the people who were part of the documentary, it was sort of a challenge for us to figure out how do you turn this sprawling thing into, you know, a 90-minute, and actually when we started, it wasn't 90 minutes, it was much shorter. It turned into a 90-minute documentary. And I think, you know, we realized pretty early on that focusing on one adoptee alone would not really do justice to what the story was, because it's obviously a program that kind of evolved over time, as Claire mentioned. It started out in this sort of post-war context with, you know, specifically mixed race children, and then it turned into something really different. So I think we kind of immediately began conceiving of this as something that would account for that sprawl and the sort of generational difference among adoptees. So then we were sort of focusing on how do we sort of account for the kind of big revelations of Tong-Hyung's reporting, including that, you know, many adoptees were switched. They believed that they were, you know, they came back to Korea to figure out who they were reunited with families. They were told were their birth families, did a DNA test and realized, oh, I'm not actually related to these people that I've just suddenly invested all of this emotional. It's very emotional to go on these journeys. And so, you know, that is one specific kind of trauma. There are others who discovered that they were taken from families who wanted them. So these are different kinds of stories. And so we sort of did it as a kind of survey, I guess, if you want to call it that, but where we sort of used the historical timeline as our narrative spine, and, you know, also unlocked the investigation over the decades through that, but really sort of used these stories of these adoptees as the heart of it, that kind of the lens through which you understand these historical events that took place and these policies that happened at a high level, but sort of trickled down and in the most profound and, you know, sort of heartbreaking ways that affected, you know, thousands and thousands of people's lives.
One thing that made the documentary so powerful was the way was Tong-Hyung, who's not here, but the way he asks questions. He becomes sort of a vehicle. You follow the story through his reporting and Claire's reporting as well. But he goes to talk to people about issues that must be profoundly emotional and important to them. And he's just very low key in how he asks questions. he's a kind of model of good reporting. I mean, if you want to see what good journalism looks like, watch him in action in this documentary, because he doesn't lead people anywhere. He lets them do the talking, and it brings out the story that way. So, can we talk a little bit about the challenges of getting this story? Because I mean, it's this sprawling story. It affects, in Korea alone, 200,000 people, and you got, by the way, there's a couple of the pieces that touch on other adoptees in the AP series. How did you go about just cracking this story? What kind of receptivity did you have from government agencies to help you, and what about the private adoption agencies, in particular the one big private adoption agency, Holt, that was behind a lot of adoptions in Korea? How did they work with you, or did they?
Well, starting with the challenges, I think the greatest challenge we had was that by the very nature of this story, it was inherently sort of old, because like these kids are adopted as babies and they can't really discover that something was amiss for 20 years or 30 years. And so by that time, you're trying to investigate something that happened a really long time ago. And so that was a real challenge, trying to track down archives and people who were in places, decades, many, many, many years before. So I do think that that passage of time was one of the most difficult things we were up against in this story. I would say that the governments in general were very not helpful, and the
Unlike most governments.
I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Korean government, was in some ways receptive to our. They were willing to talk with us about the work they were doing. They were at the time, working on their report, which came out recently since our story's published. The U.S. government was not particularly useful, and European governments, they had been more reflective, and they had been more interested in learning about their own culpability and their own past. And so I'd say that those governments were more receptive and more open about their history in terms of adoption. We did have an interview with one of the largest adoption agency in the United States, Holt, and I would say that they were open. We talked to them for hours. They were very eager to defend their practices. I think that their story.
For people who don't know, because you get into the Holt agency, maybe tell a little bit about who is this Holt and how did they become the big adoption agency?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I could talk about this all night. You guys want to stay after? I am obsessed with the Holt family, but there was a farmer named Harry Holt who has no history in child welfare or adoption or anything. And after that, he watches a documentary in 1954 or something about Korean war orphans and decides that he's a Christian and decides that he has been called by God to just go to Korea and start picking up babies and bringing them to the United States to give them for himself and some of his friends first. And then that was so popular and so well received that he opens up an adoption agency and starts bringing babies by the plane load for other Christian families. And that over time it becomes the Holt Adoption Agency, and it expands to become what is still the largest adoption agency in the world today.
Claire, can you say a little bit about Holt Korea? Because we had to there were two Holts, essentially. There is Holt International and there's Holt Korea.
Well, these started out as one, and in 1977 they split. And so there are 4 operational adoption agencies in Korea. Holt is the largest by far, and Holt US, now it expanded to countries all over the world. So while this project focused on adoption from Korea, children over the decades since then have been adopted from many other countries, from Guatemala, from Haiti, and Holt and many other adoption agencies have been involved in that.
So Holt International, we did encounter some of them passing the buck and say, "Oh, that wasn't us. That was Holt Korea," as if they had nothing to do with each other. That happened a lot. Holt was also very defensive about if anything happened, it happened in the past. Was very much the line that they took. But the fact is, a lot of these adoptees are trying now to figure out what happened, and Holt is not being particularly helpful, maybe because they actually don't have a lot of the documents.
But let me ask a provocative question. If there had been no DNA testing, would these issues have ever surfaced, or would people feel like, yeah, you know, it worked out fine for everybody?
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things that has struck me so much about this project and this story is how it really shows the power of the narrator of a story. For so long, the story of adoption in this country has been told through the lens of adoptive parents, and it took on the story of this beautiful thing where adoption is sort of the end point, and the assumption is that it is a lovely story. And it wasn't until those kids grew up and in a lot of ways met each other. And so I think it's a combination of both DNA and organizing online. So a lot of these people created communities on Facebook and started realizing that they were not the only ones. And so they came together and shared their stories, and then their story became the story we told. And like I do think it became this powerful thing that started challenging that narrative that had been so ingrained in the American story of adoption, which is that it's this beautiful fairy tale.
I think also there's the issue of what leads people to look for the DNA in the first place, to answer your question. As in, we came across many adoptees who felt something was wrong, who felt disconnected in some way, who felt like, you know, especially the ones who had come here as older children. So in other words, they were already trying to figure out, why is this so messy? Why do I feel like I can't connect? There were a lot of emotional issues that drove them to find out more.
When you say older children, we're talking, what, 3, 4?
Claire, you can better answer that. How old did they get?
Are we talking about the people who were taken and realized that something was wrong?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, 3, 4, 5 years old. And to answer your question directly about DNA, I mean, I think DNA is the most powerful thing to prove for sure that some of these more nefarious stories were true. You know, one story we highlighted in the tech stories was this mom in Korea who had been looking for her kid for decades. She put in Korea on it's almost like American milk cartons, like missing kids. It's on like snack boxes. Like her kid's face had been on snack boxes for decades. And it wasn't until a DNA test that this woman in her 40s finds out that her face had been on Korean snack boxes all her childhood, and she'd been living in the United States with a new family because she'd been taken out of her neighborhood and adopted abroad. And so it does require DNA to prove that.
But even without the DNA, I think you can see, especially in the sort of later waves of adoptees, that there are very clear inconsistencies in the adoption paperwork. So you'll have, you know, multiple accounts of a relinquishment within one set of papers. So I think even without that, I think the DNA helps to prove a lot of the suspicions some adoptees have, but the paperwork itself is often very flawed.
So what was the motive? Why does the Korean government in this period of time from the 1950s through the 1990s, let's say, why do they feel it's imperative to get kids adopted overseas? Because surely this information is available. It wouldn't require a whole lot of digging around to read these documents and see that there are multiple accounts and there's a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old who you could figure out had parents. Like, why did the Korean government not look into this?
One point Tong-Hyung makes, which I thought was really interesting, was for the Korean government, it was an alternative to a social welfare program. In other words, in some cases, these were children of poor families that were taken. And so the Korean government was like, we'll just send them to somebody else to look after. Some of them were also mixed kids. And especially after the war, this was very controversial. So Claire, am I right in saying that the earliest ones were more of the mixed kids, and then it sort of expanded to many more people? So I think those were two things with the Korean government, but also it brought money in. I mean, people at every level were being paid. And I think that's some of the things we found really interesting was how much people at every level were being paid.
Yeah, I wish Tong-Hyung was here because he could talk about this forever. I mean, fundamentally, I think what he would say is that, yes, this was bringing a lot of foreign currency into Korea at a time when they needed it. But more importantly, and much more valuable, it meant that Korea didn't have to build a social safety net of any kind, because kids that it didn't want to provide for, it was simply sending away. And so it didn't have to take care of them. It didn't have to take care of kids that it decided to be sort of socially undesirable, and how it defined that. It feels gross even saying this, but how it defined those things sort of changed over time as Korea changed. At first, right after the war, it was children who were mixed race, which you mentioned, and those were largely children who were half Korean and half white or black, the children of American or British service members. And then over time that changed. It became the children of single mothers, or then even expanded even further just to the children of impoverished people who were poor and couldn't afford to take care of them. So
Was there a foreign policy dimension to it as well?
yeah, definitely. This was incredibly popular in Western countries. We found, diplomatic records of diplomats going to Korea, basically begging for more babies, saying, it's really important for us to keep this baby pipeline pumping.
And not just U.S. diplomats.
No, actually, this was specifically, those documents were Scandinavian countries. Those were Denmark, I think, I can't remember, Norway, I think.
In one of them, there's actually the veiled suggestion that we really want you to keep doing this if you want relations to be smooth between us. It was really something.
It's so. Just talk a little bit about the challenge adoptions in other countries, adoptions from other countries are experiencing now. Is this happening? Is what happened in Korea happening now in other countries? Did it go from Korea? I mean, many of you know, New Yorker readers all know that Barbara Demick, who was on the jury of the Oz Prize in past years, has just published a book about Chinese adoptions, excerpted in last week's New Yorker. And it sounds like there's a lot of common elements there. But how did this go from Korea into other places, whether China or Eastern Europe or Latin America?
Yeah, over time, the model that was created in Korea, which was really where foreign adoption was born, spread around the world, and other companies got into it. And I won't bore you to tears, but there was something called the Hague Convention, which tried to improve this, which tried to make it more ethical, but that wasn't ratified by the U.S. until 2008. And so before that, anything goes. Anybody could have opened an adoption agency and started adopting kids from one place to another. There was no accrediting system. And so adoption agencies would pop up. You'll see, if you ever look at the numbers of adoptions from different countries, there's a reason that there'll be a big spike in a place like Ethiopia, for example, or a big spike in Congo. And it's because the adoption industry moves into a place, they adopt out a lot of babies, and then that country realizes that something is amiss and kind of cracks down and often shuts it down. So Ethiopia stops adoptions, and this has gone in waves. There's a big wave of kids from Guatemala, Russia. There was Eastern European adoptions for a long time. China, interestingly, just recently closed international adoptions. That was the last really big sending country. And so I think the future of international adoption is really perilous right now. I think that it really is a question about whether this is a practice that's even going to survive at all in any serious numbers.
One thing to also just add about Korea, which Tong-Hyung always points out, is that there's actually kind of, it in some ways, even though it's the blueprint, it kind of like defies the model in some ways, because they start adopting right after the war, when, you know, it's a war-torn country, economically devastated. But over the decades, Korea ends up becoming an economic powerhouse. But ironically, as Korea's economic fortunes rise, their adoption numbers also rise. So in the 1980s, they're getting ready to host the Olympics, and the adoption numbers skyrocket. So that's kind of, I think, that was one of the first things that made Tong-Hyung's eyebrows raise. Like, why would that happen? That doesn't seem like it would, you know, go with the way these patterns usually take place. So, you know, in some ways, even though Korea is kind of like the pioneer of this, it also defies models, because the government actually went out of its way to deregulate it so that they could make this easier as part of this project that Mary was describing.
One of the early things that really sort of hooked Tong-Hyung was we've worked together on and off for 6 or 7 years. There was an early story about an abusive facility in South Korea. It wasn't just for orphans, so it was all number of people. It was people taken off the streets. Tong-Hyung found that as part of that facility, what he found was that there were kids who were taken, stored there, and then sent. So that raised the question for him of how much is this happening and how many facilities like this are there. So that also got him thinking about, you know, what exactly is this train of sending alleged orphans overseas.
So we're going to open up to questions in a second, but one more thing I want to just cover on the adoptees side. You did a piece about the sort of missing nationality of some kids who are adopted, and I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the number of adoptees in America who don't have nationality, don't have citizenship, and how they got left behind.
Well, remarkably, really, nobody knows exactly how many of them there are because nobody tracked them. Basically, for the first several decades of adoption, international adoption was sort of shoehorned into the system of adoption created for domestic adoption. So it's boring and in the weeds, I'm sorry, but it's like basically there's a first step process where kids came in from abroad, and that goes to the federal government. That's like an immigration issue. But then the adoption itself is finalized through a state court system. So it's kind of a two-part system. And so the idea is that an adoption is finalized in the state court system. And then for many, many years, an adoptive parent was then required to naturalize their kid. And some unknown number of people just never did that. And no government agency, neither the state nor the federal government that did allow these kids to come in on visas, never made sure that that happened. And so incredibly, a lot of these people grew up and had no idea they weren't American citizens until they went to apply for a passport. Or in one case, one woman I talked to, like, worked her whole life and went to apply for Social Security benefits as a senior citizen and learned only then that she was never made an American citizen. And there have been bills in Congress over and over and over again, and they have just simply not passed. And this is not just Korean adoptions. This is adoptees from all over the world. And in fact, some of these people have been deported. And we interviewed a man who was deported to Ethiopia. So a man who was adopted by an American soldier as a very young child, brought to the United States, committed some like minor drug offenses, and ended up being deported back to Ethiopia, and now lives in a shack with a mud floor. And so there's a lot of these adoptees, obviously, given the current administration and the current climate surrounding immigration, are pretty terrified about their status. And a lot of people are living sort of in the shadows, because at the moment they begin an immigration case, they ask to solve this problem, is they're alerting the government to the fact that they're living here illegally, allegedly. So a lot of people are in a pretty difficult situation.
One thing I think I should say, just out of fairness, that there were people in this system who genuinely thought they were doing a good thing. a diplomat that Claire found who said, I thought this was a great program, and he was really disturbed by what we found, and also adoptive parents. I mean, I think one of the most heartbreaking stories was a parent who said, you know, I didn't adopt out of Mexico because I was so afraid that I would end up with somebody else's children. And then now this is like a rock in my heart because I'm thinking maybe I did end up with somebody else's children. And I just can't even imagine what that would be like. We talked about doing something on that, but we felt firstly that there was already a lot of attention to Western points of view and, you know, US points of view. And we wanted this to focus on Korean adoptees. But it is, I mean, one mother traveled to, where was it when she found that her kids had parents? Which country was it, Claire, that she traveled to introduce them to their birth parents? So
It was Congo, but I don't
yeah,
remember.
yeah.
Remarkable.
So we haven't talked too much about the money in all this. We've talked about Holt with, you know, trying to rescue these kids, and talked about the Korean government trying to ease their welfare burden. But, you know, was somebody making a lot of money here? I mean, can we talk more about that motivation in the, you know, sort of adoption industry?
Sure. Yes, the adoption industry is a multi-billion-dollar business, and it has been for a while. I mean, it's shrinking in terms of profit now because the number of adoptions has gone down very dramatically over the last few years. It's down to just a few thousand today. A lot of the adoption agencies like Holt are nonprofits, and you know, Holt at this point, and I do think it's important to say, is very well respected even among people who are inclined to be critical of foreign adoption agencies. They do, their company has transitioned to doing a lot more family preservation work in countries all around the world. And so they do reinvest quite a bit of money in that kind of work in terms of like creating situations where they can try to keep, you know, a lot of the criticism of foreign adoption is that why aren't we spending the money to keep families together in their homes? And so, you know, Holt, I believe, responded to that criticism over the decades by, you know, trying to reinvest some of that money in programs. There are a lot of other adoption agencies that have been prosecuted here and there, not with, I think, the rigor that a lot of people would have liked to see, that are just sort of money-making endeavors. And I think that there is there has long been a huge lack of regulation over the for-profit adoption agencies.
Thank you very much. Edith Lederer, the Associated Press Chief Correspondent at the United Nations, and congratulations to my AP colleagues and to Frontline for a really important documentary. My question is, what reaction have you gotten from Koreans here in this country to the documentary? What have they said about it?
Yeah, I mean, the reaction has been staggering. I think, you know, one thing that we've heard consistently, especially from adoptees, is that it's something that they have to watch with a lot of care for their own emotional states, because it is extremely triggering. And this is, you know, very traumatizing. I think it's hard to understand as a non-adoptee, like how deep this trauma gets into the very recesses of adoptees' psyches. This is about their identity and their family, these like very foundational things. So I think it was sort of greeted with a lot of trepidation within the community, but I think there was also a real sense of validation, because for so long, I mean, I think, get documents that are official, and that is truth, right? It's on paper. It says this is my name and this is the date of my birth. And to question that feels like you're being a conspiracy theorist. And then it turns out these facts that are on paper were actually false. And so to be saying that into the ether for so many years and to feel it in your bones and to have that invalidated by adoption agencies and by other people that you meet. And so I think the documentary being released and all the reporting that's been published in the AP, for many of the adoptees we've spoken to, it felt like finally we're seeing people, are recognizing what we've been saying all along. And that felt like a very sort of prevailing feeling there.
We have time for one last question if there's somebody here.
Hi, thank you all so much for your talk. I'm a journalist myself, and I was very inspired by your documentary. I started kind of digging around Chinese adoption myself, and I've spoken to some adoptees, and something that I heard that is very interesting to me is that some of these adoptees are advocates of adoption, and one reason that they would give is that they are concerned about children with disability. So they would give an example of like a child with a cleft palate. That is something that is very easily fixable in the United States, but they might get abandoned in China where there's just no resources to fix it. So my question is, in your process, did you encounter these complexities, and did you ever hear from advocates of adoption that kind of made your story a little more complex?
Yeah, definitely.
No, I was going to say very much so.
And I think you should keep digging. I mean, I've long said that I think you could report on every country where adoption has been from, and you would find really interesting stories. So I'm glad that you're doing that. But yeah, of course, adoption is a really complicated issue. And so I do think that, I mean, we should have maybe said from the outset that, this is a program that was designed to find families for children that need families. And that was like ultimately what the goal was. The criticism is that it was corrupted over time to be a system to find children for families who want them. And so, and so, yes, I mean, I think that what advocates for adoption will say is that now adoption, after the Hague Convention, which I mentioned, is that adoption has sort of gone back to what it was intended to be, which is that there's far fewer adoptions. Children tend to be older, and children tend to have special needs, really severe special needs. And so, yeah, international adoption is really complicated, and that's one of the main reasons that people are really devastated now that that international adoption is ending. I mean, some adoptees are anti-adoption and think it is a practice that should be ended. There are other people who think that it is a practice that we need to save for this very reason, because there are kids that are in countries that cannot care for them properly. And so it is an incredibly emotional debate on both sides. And yeah, I mean, I don't know that anybody has the answer, obviously.
Thank you, Claire, Lora, Mary, and Tong-Hyung, who's not here, for an amazing package and great journalism. And thank you all for being here tonight. And please join me in thanking them and congratulating them on the award.